Hey class, in this video I'm going to be covering arrays in JavaScript. This is following up on the loops video. Loops and arrays are usually used together, but they don't have to be. In this instance, we are going to be using arrays specifically with the loops that we use to create our scenery in the last example. So I'm going to get started. I'm going to talk a little bit about what an array is, then show how to add scenery using arrays along with the loops. So let's get started. I'm going to open up GitHub and I'm going to make another new project. So I'm going to be updating some of what we did in the last video. So I'm going to make another copy of the folder. So this will be project 1-3. So on the Mac, I'm going to hit Command D to duplicate. You can hit copy and paste on PC or the Mac. So I'm just going to make project 1-3. And then I'm gonna open this folder in Sublime. And so let's add a link here. I forgot to add the thumbnail last time. I'll do that at the end of this video. So let's make this one project 1-3. And we'll keep adding to this. You might eventually want to just have one of the versions of the projects up here, whatever you prefer. But this will make it easier to access. So I'm just going to say this is project number 1 with arrays. I'm going to go to Tools, make sure my Sublime server is running, and then open up a new incognito window. I just use that so I have the basic Chrome setup, and then go to localhost 8080. And so I'll replace these thumbnails at the end of this lecture. I forgot to do that in the last one. So this is the scene that we had last time. And one of the things that we have here is that you don't really have a lot of control, even though we can add a bunch of trees to our scene. We can't really decide exactly where those trees are going to be without doing some more advanced math. And that's because we are just using the math that the loop has kind of by default. And so we can't actually choose specific points. And so that's one thing that an array is really useful for. And so that's what we're going to look at doing today in 2 different versions. So one that's relatively simple and then one that's a little more complex. So I'm going to do a couple examples of what an array is in the console just so we can get used to the syntax, and then I'll add it into our project. So an array is basically just a list of items. So any list that you can think of, you might have a list of groceries or a list of games that you're waiting to play or something like that. To create an array, we create a variable just like any other variable, and we can name it just like any other variable. So let's say I was going to create a list of animals. I can say animals and then equals, just like a regular variable. The difference is, instead of saying something like cat here, what I would say is I would start with a square bracket and then close the square bracket eventually, and then I have a semicolon. So when we use an array, the way that we tell JavaScript that we want an array or a list is using the square bracket. So inside the square brackets, we can create as many animals as we want, and we just separate them with commas. So if I have a cat and then a dog and then a bird, now I have a list, and instead of 3 different variables to keep track of my 3 animals, I have one variable that keeps track of all 3. And the way it does that is by using these indexes. So indexes is just a word for a counter or a number index. So 0 index, we start at 0 in programming, so the 0 index of the array is cat, the 1 index of the array is dog, and the 2 index of the array is bird. So if I want to access or change the first animal, I would just say animals at 0, and I would get cat. And if I want to change that, I can say animals at 0 gets lizard. And now my animals array contains a lizard, a dog, and a bird. So that's a basic premise. I can add or subtract as many of these as I want. There's a couple functions that go along with arrays, and so I'll go over those because they are going to be useful. So one thing with an array is we can figure out how many there are in our array. So if we want to say how many animals are there, say animals.length, and that gives us 3. And we know that's true because if we look at the animals, we have 1, 2, 3. So animals.length will always tell us how big the list is. So if I add an animal, if I say animals at 3 equals koala, now animals.length changes to 4. So .length is always, whatever the current length or number of elements in the array is. So now I have 0, 1, 2, 3 for a total of 4 animals in my array. So if we want to add something to the array, we can also use the push function. We can say animals.push, and this basically just adds something to the end. So if I add it's another animal, a giraffe, to the end of the array, now I have animals with 5. Okay, and so with the push, I have to actually give it an argument inside the parentheses so it knows what to push. The opposite of that, or the inverse of that, or whatever, is pop. So if I pop, now I'm just removing whatever the last element is, and because it's just whatever the last element is, I don't actually have to say pop giraffe like I did push, because it just is already giraffe, and so if I say pop, it's just going to pop off whatever's there. So that's push and pop. You can also do a version of push and pop at the beginning of the array. So if I say animals.unshift, so that's how to add. So if I want to put the giraffe in front, I can say unshift, and so then animals will have giraffe at the beginning of the list. Or I can say animals.shift, and that just removes whatever the first element in the list is. So we probably won't use those as much, but just so you're aware, those are the other ways we can add or remove elements from a list. There's a lot more stuff that you can do with a list, but we're not going to really worry about those for now, because we're not going to be changing our list too much. We're just going to be setting them up and then modifying them. So in this case, let's use some arrays to actually do some drawing. And what we can do is, instead of drawing all our trees just in a line like this, we can actually choose some specific points where we want those trees to go. And so I'm going to make an array for the X and Y values of my trees and use those arrays to tell the trees where to go. So I'm going to close this, go to project 1-3 and open my sketch. Oh, I forgot to update this. Let's call this 1-3, adding arrays to setting positions. And I don't really care about the date right now. So we need an X and Y for the positions of the trees, and we can also use this to decide how many trees there are going to be. And I actually have foreground trees and background trees. So let's start with the background trees. So I'm just going to say variable, I'll call this bg tree X. So I'll just have a list of X positions. So that's one list, and bg tree Y is a list of the Y positions. So I can kind of just start by adding stuff here and then testing it. So I'm just going to add one tree to start. So I'll put it on the X something low like 50, and on the Y something high like 400. So that'll be my first tree. We'll just test where that is, and then we can go from there. So that's the X value. It's the first one in the list, and that's the Y value. It's the first one in that list. And so now when I do my loop, instead of counting across the width, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the length of this list to decide where to draw the trees. And this is a little tricky. In the second example I'm going to do, we're going to see a better way to do this that's a little more complicated. The only issue here is that if your two lists are not the same length, you'll run into trouble. But let's try that. So I'm going to get rid of this for loop for my trees. Okay, so I'm taking out the background trees. And so now I'm going to say for, and usually with a list, if I'm counting, just like a generic list, I use I, and I'm going to have a bunch of for loops here. So I'm going to use let I equal 0. So when we have let I equal 0, that's going to give us our first value, since the 0 index is the first value in each of these arrays. Let me collapse these functions so it'll be closer. So then we're just going to count as long as I is less than bg tree X dot length. Okay, so the length of this array is just 1 right now, because there's one element. But because that's the 0 index, we can start at 0. 0 is less than 1. We'll draw the tree here, and then our loop will just stop because I will increase. We'll do I plus plus. So I will increase to 1. 1 is not less than 1, and so then our array will just stop. So the array.length is a really convenient way of counting through all of the numbers that we have in this array. So let's keep going. So I want to draw, the way that I reference the value is by using this I value. So I'm going to draw an image of the tree image, and the x value is bg tree x, and then the square brackets at I. So remember, the square brackets is the way that I reference each value. So with my animals array, let's see if I still have that. No, so let's see if I can get that animals array back. There we go. So if I wanted the first value in my animals array, I would say animals at 0. But inside of our loop, I is what we're using to count each time. And so I is what we use to grab that x value. So it's a little bit complicated if you haven't seen that before, but you'll see how it works in a moment. So then for the y value, we just have bg tree y, and then we also use at I for this one. That should draw one tree in the background. I don't see it, so let's actually just comment out our foreground trees for a moment. Okay, so there is a tree there. It's just a little too far down. So let's move this back up to like 300. Okay, so there we go. That's good. Let's move our character down a bit. I set Jerry X to width over, or Jerry Y's height over 2. Let's add like 100 to that. Okay, that's good. So now we have this one tree position, and so we can add some more trees just based on whatever positions we want. So let's move over a bit on X and maybe move somewhere else on the Y. And so we have another tree. That's a little too high up, so we can move that down. And so now we can actually place the trees in specific locations according to where we want them. So we can create a more natural look to our scene. So let's just add a couple more trees. Just gonna keep going on X, go to like 200, and maybe go down further on the Y. Okay. And then let's keep going on the X. I ended up obviously just using pretty normal values here. Let's move that down a bit further. You could also do something fancy if you wanted to like use some event listener to, you know, click on places where you want trees and then place them there. But let's just keep going. So we could actually, you know what I can do is just console.log mouse X, mouse Y. So this is just for development purposes. So now I can see where it is. So they're drawing from the middle. So maybe if I want a tree right there, that's about 423, 333. So I can add that in there, 423 X, 333 on the Y. Okay. And then let's add one like right here. So 507, 336. So that's one way to kind of get these values instead of just making them up. Okay, let's move that one down a bit. Okay, and then let's put one like back up here. 571, 267. Okay, so now we have our foreground trees. I'm gonna comment this out for now. And so by using the array, I can actually specify points where I want my trees, but still have the advantage of using a loop so that I don't have to do like image tree, you know, at each one of these each time. And now I can make a lot of changes to my scene just by looking at these values up here instead of having to go hunt through my code. So those are all my background trees. For the foreground trees, you know, we can actually leave those the same. Maybe we can think like those were planted in a specific way. I'm just gonna change this value a bit. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Maybe I'll bring this back down a bit. And I kind of want it to go over here. So maybe say width like plus 100 so we get another tree over there. I guess we're not gonna get another one there. There we go, okay. So we can kind of play around with those until we get something we like. Okay, so in the next part, so that's using a couple arrays to set up these trees. In the next part, I'm going to do something a little more complicated, which is I'm going to actually have arrays inside of an array. Since we do need the X and Y points, we'll have an array that includes both of those. So that's one. And then we're also actually going to add a little animation to the clouds as well. So for our clouds, we're going to rewrite these clouds. And instead of using the cloud counter, we're going to use an array. But we could see there's some issues with using two arrays for the X data and the Y data. One is that we have to make sure they're the same length, and we also have to make sure that these are matching correctly. So, you know, this X goes with this Y versus this X and this Y, where normally we have X and Y right next to each other. So what we can actually do is we can put arrays inside of an array. This is a little crazy, but if I want to make my cloud positions array with 2 positions for each, I can have an array here, and then I can have another array inside of it. And I can have X and Y, and then I can keep going and adding more and more arrays. Usually the way that I would style that is by actually putting like a new space here and just putting an array like this and then comma like this. So that way I can space it out a bit more. And let's actually call this cloud position so that we can have more than one. So for the first cloud position, let's just say it's like somewhere around here. So like 100, 100. So in this one, the X value is going to be there and the Y value is going to be there. And so then let's do another cloud like down here somewhere. So maybe like 200 on X and 150 on Y. So we'll start there. We can add some more in a moment. So in this loop, I'm going to start this over again. So I'm going to get rid of that one, and I'm going to say, and let's actually make the clouds go on top of the trees for this one, because I noticed there is some overlap and it looks kind of weird. So we'll put the clouds second, so the clouds will be on top. So we'll say for let I equal 0. So again, most of your arrays that you're ever going to write will look like that. You're always going to start counting at 0 because 0 is the first element in the array. So as long as I is less than cloud positions dot length. So the thing that's nice here is I just have one length that I have to worry about. I don't have to worry if my X and my Y are the same length. And then of course I'm going to I++, I'm going to count through the positions of the clouds. And so now I just have the image, the cloud image, and then for the X position, it's cloud positions, and it's at I, so that's where we are in our array. So I is going to be 0, and then I is going to be 1. So I goes first, and then for the X, we go to 0. So that's when you have an array inside of an array. We have, this gives us the position of the array, and then inside the array, we want 0 for X, and then we have cloud positions at I at 1 for Y. So that's a bit more complicated, and you can definitely stick with, you know, the X and Y arrays if you prefer that. But this does look a little bit cleaner because we just have this nice list of positions with the X and Y for each position. So it's a bit more complex, but it does a lot more for us. Okay, so there's my clouds. So we can add a few more clouds here. Let's turn up our mouse X, mouse Y again, just so we can see. Maybe I want one like here. So that's like 351, 44. And so it's a lot easier to add these in. I just go 351, comma 44. I don't have to like edit 2 different ones. And then let's have another one like right here, 492, 103. Okay, and I'm going to turn off console.log. And let's have one more cloud maybe down here. So let's bring that back on. So down here is like 446, 182. And I'll move this guy over a bit just so they're not so close. Okay. So that looks good. You can add or delete as many clouds as you want. And so now our little guy is moving around. He's got some trees behind him, some trees in front. And that looks pretty good. One last thing that I'm going to do is actually add some animation to the clouds, because usually they wouldn't just be sitting there. And since we have arrays with persistent values, we can actually change those values. We wouldn't have been able to do this in the previous example just using a loop. So I'm going to save this. And so I have like this X value and this Y value. And I'm going to make some changes to those. What I can do, if I want to get like the clouds to just animate across the screen, I can just increase those values. So I can say cloud positions at I at 0. So if I just want to add some nice slow animation here, I can say +2. Okay, so the clouds obviously disappear. So I think we covered this in MMP 210, but this is a place where I can add a little if statement to reset. So I'll say if cloud positions at I at 0, so that's the X value. So I'm going to put a comment here, say increase X, just because this doesn't actually say X, so it's good to know that this is what's happening. So if that goes above the width of the canvas, so if it goes all the way to the right, we can just reset it. So I'll say equals 0. So now the clouds will kind of reappear on the other side. And they kind of jump over because we're not accounting for the width. If you want to account for the width, just say plus cloud image dot width and then divide by 2 since we're drawing from the center. And then we can add that. We can subtract that from 0. So we just do minus cloud image dot width divide by 2. This is just kind of, you know, if you want to be a stickler for these things, that looks kind of nice. And then if we want to get like a little wiggling going on with the Y, so they're not just like kind of going way like in the same direction, we can take the Y value. So let's grab this and then change it to Y. And let's just like give it a random number. So I haven't reviewed random yet, but you guys probably remember random. I'm just going to give this a random, a really small, like negative 0.5 to 0.5. And so I'm just going to say random Y. And so we get a little bit of wiggling in the clouds. It's kind of a nice effect. If you make these values bigger, you'll get more wiggling. You might lose some clouds at some point, but for now we're not really super worried about that because these scenes we're just kind of starting. Again, randomness is a good thing to use pretty much anywhere. Like if I throw some randomness in here, that's going to make these guys move at different paces, so that's kind of nice. But this is actually getting a little bit too jittery, so you know, you don't have to use that. That's just something I like to use to kind of add some quick animation in there. So I'm just going to put a comment here that says animate the clouds. And so again, the reason that we can animate these clouds is because we do have these persistent data points, the X and Y. That wouldn't really work with the loop because the loop by itself is just repeating the information. And so the positions of the information have to stay the same. So yeah, that looks pretty good. I think I'm pretty happy with what this looks like so far. I know I've covered a lot, so if you want to review anything or go over anything, let me know. I will include some links to some other tutorials and resources that cover these concepts in more depth if you want to get a little more background. But hopefully most of this stuff you've seen before. So yeah, so let's do a couple more things. I'm just gonna add the thumbnails to my homepage, this page. So I want to add a thumbnail for each one of these projects. So I'm gonna say save, and this is version 1-3. So we'll just save that. Okay, so I have this like thumbnail here, then I have the portrait, and then I have the project. Oh, I put the thumbnail in here. Okay, so let's put these in there with the projects themselves. So I'm gonna go to downloads. Here's version 1-3. I'll put that in project 1-3. And then let's go back and go to project 1. And I'm gonna move him down here because it looks cooler when he's kind of hiding. And I'm just going to do save. This is V1-2. Feel free to call these whatever you want. And I'm going to drop that into project 1-2. And so let's add those into our code. So I'm going to close out this sketch and go to the main page, index.html. And so I'm going to replace this first thumbnail with project 1-2 slash v1-2.png. The naming is getting a little wacky here. I'll try to clean this up in the future. This is v1-3.png. So now we should have different thumbnails. And so yeah, that's nice. We're kind of seeing our progress. So we're going from just a character to a character kind of in a weird scene to a character in a slightly more normal looking scene. So yeah, there's our character. I guess I should add like a back button to these projects. But yeah, that's it for this video. I'm going to just upload these on GitHub and I'll share these examples. So I'm going to say adds, arrays, and loops examples, and commit to master, and push to origin. So I'll include links to those in the video description.